So when we start composing illustrations from scratch, essentially in Illustrator, one of the most common tools to use is the pen tool, which is right here. Looks like an old school calligraphy pen. And then there's some other options underneath it, as you can see with the little arrow, which we'll talk about. The pen tool, add anchor point, delete anchor point, and the anchor point tool, which allows you to convert anchor points from a curved anchor point to a. We'll get into it as we go. Here we go. So these are some of the exercises from the book. I was going to have you do a bunch of these, but you can do these exercises on your own, and I feel like after the demo, jumping into the assignment is going to be what we're going to do. So we have, and I'll go through these, a couple of exercises here, walking you through using the pen tool if you've never used it before, making some straight lines, and then making some curved lines, and there's some other exercises as well, and I'll show you about that convert anchor tool. And then here's where we're going to start with our homework. We're going to start to create and assemble an illustration. We're going to basically make this little, I don't know if you guys have looked at it, jumped ahead and looked at it, but we're going to be creating this little snowball guy that's in Chapter 3. That's in Chapter 3. So these are all the parts that we're essentially going to be tracing with our pen tool, and you'll see we have a handy little for making these shapes, and I'll walk through it as well. But for making these shapes, you go from 1, 2, 3, kind of like a more advanced connect the dots as we have going on. And we also have a couple of these little visual cues for where to drag our curved lines, the Bezier curve, our curved lines to form these pieces. So you'll see, obviously, we have an arm, a head, an eye, his iris, his hat, and we're going to be tracing these and then adding color to them, adding some attributes to them, and then assembling them together into our little snowball guy. And we'll do this in a couple parts. But first, so we'll show you drawing lines is fairly simple. So when you have your pen tool, your standard pen tool here, we'll start at the beginning here, and this is where your smart guides can come in super handy. And I know we've talked about open paths and closed paths before. So these would be, we're going to be creating open paths. They're essentially just lines, right? And then here we're going to be creating a closed path, so where your start and your end is here. For doing some of these exercises and some of the assignments, this is where your smart guides can really come in handy, because you can really nail like where they want you to start. As you can see here, our smart guide showing you the center, so we can get pretty accurate to where they want us to pinpoint these lines. But I'll kind of go through these relatively quickly. So using the pen tool just to create straight lines is as simple as just clicking. So you're clicking once to add an anchor, and then you'll see you get this, I'll zoom in again, you see you get this little blue guide telling you where your line is going to fall. And we go to the next dot here, and we just click once again, and it connects the two anchor points with a straight path. And then again here, and then as you see going to our center here. Now, a couple of things that are happening here that are super common, and it tends to throw people off. You can see as we went from, here I'll go back a step, as we went from this step to this step, it has a white fill here because we have our default, when I opened Illustrator, was a white fill with a black stroke, right? So basically what it was doing, it was filling these points that we created with the black stroke and then filling it with the white fill, and it doesn't have a stroke going at the top, obviously, because it's an open path, right? So then when we went to, I'll just redo, ooh, or not. No, cancel that. And then as we go to this line, or this path rather, now you can see it gets kind of funky as it's trying to fill this area. And why, the reason that it's sort of making this sort of odd fill is because essentially it's trying to fill between the open paths, right? So it's filling this area between the open path and then this area between the open paths, and then it's giving you this sort of cutoff because it's sort of ending, and this is the end point and this is the start point. So this tends to happen a lot, especially when we get into the snowball pieces. As you start to make like some of the funkier shapes, when you start to draw, you'll see if you have your fill on, it'll kind of cover what you're doing. So kind of by default, whenever I start drawing, I didn't do it here on purpose because I wanted to show you that. But whenever I start, I usually just make sure that my fill here, that my fill here is off. And then I'm just using my stroke. And sometimes, honestly, sometimes I will, I mean, for this demo, it doesn't really matter, but for sometimes if I'm drawing something, where are my swatches? There we go. If I'm drawing something and I really want to see like what I'm doing, like sometimes I'll change the color to like a really bright, obnoxious color so I can like really, see it jump out from my background, I guess. You don't have to do that for these. I think, yeah, for going to these here, the colors aren't too bad. So if you did a black line over this yellow, they made sure not to, like if I'm tracing something usually that's a dark color or black or something like that, like I'll change my stroke to like bright yellow or cyan or magenta or something like that, just so it really jumps out of me. Anyway, so going back to this, so now we're done creating this line segment, right? Just by clicking our paths, or clicking our anchors rather, and connecting them with a path, right? There's a couple different things you can do. Once you're done, now you see it wants to make me put another anchor down, right? So if we click anywhere, it's going to give us another anchor to path. The easiest thing to do is just hit escape, and then now you can see you can start in a new spot and do the next one. Or if you click on a different tool, like if you go to your select tool, now it has your bounding box and the whole thing, and then you can go back to your pen tool and start in a new spot. Again, clicking and creating our paths and our anchors. And again, hitting escape is the easiest way, especially if you're going to make multiple objects like this. Hitting escape is the best way to sort of get out of get out of the pen tool if you're going to start another object like we are here. So creating a closed path here is relatively similar. So all we're doing here is we're just sort of tracing this object like we did the other objects at the top, with the major difference here being we're going to end rather where we started, and you'll see when we hover over that same anchor point, that little O, whatever that is, it's the closing path symbol. It tells you that it's going to be a closed path instead of an open path. It shows you that you're overlapping on the same path that you started with, so it's going to create, oops, and I just missed it. It's going to create a closed path. So now, when we fill, we have our nice closed path. There's no empty spots. If we if we go to adjust this like any other shape, we've now created a closed path in a similar way to using our our object tools, a rectangle, triangle, etc. So if you want to create a closed path, that's pretty much all you do is, you're just drawing and clicking, and then you're overlapping that same path that you started with. And now we have our sort of funkier closed path. So that's pretty basic. Drawing straight lines is fairly simple with the pen tool. Basically, again, when you click down your anchor points, it creates a path between those two anchor points. To make horizontal or vertical straight lines, like if you want to go perfectly straight, your smart guides tend to help. Or you can hold shift, and you can see now, as I'm sort of like with anything that we've talked about, moving an object, creating an object, etc. As I'm sort of shifting my mouse here, my line isn't moving. It's going to hold that. It's going to snap to hold that horizontal line as if I let go of that shift button. And it won't. Oops. I was going to say it shouldn't. There we go. It's going to snap to the next the next rotational option, which is 45 degrees. So it takes a while before it's gonna snap. And again, if you wanted to do it vertically, you're just holding down that shift. You can see it takes a while before it's gonna snap to the next. So if you wanted to make a square or a rectangle in this case, square isn't very square, but you get the idea. Now you have perfectly horizontal and vertical lines. Again, when we get into curves, it works a little bit differently. I'm going to show you modifying modifying a path with some of the other tools that we have here. Adding anchor points, deleting anchor points, and then in a little bit the anchor point tool to convert anchor points. So adding anchor points is pretty much what it says. So if you want to add an anchor point either to a line segment or a closed or open path, you go to your add anchor point tool, and you're on it because it's got the pen tool with a little plus. And let's say we wanted to create another anchor point, give or take about halfway down this line. You just go to the path that you want to add the anchor point to, and you just click on it. And now, as we go to our direct selection tool, now we have a brand new anchor point to play around with, right? Now let's say you had this extra anchor point and you wanted to delete it. A common thing that people do, which is a mistake, is they'll grab the direct selection tool and click on this anchor and just delete it. But what ends up happening is that creates an open path, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a crazy big deal because, like I'll show you below, you can grab these two anchor points and join them. It just creates like one extra step by deleting and then having to join and whatever. Or you can use your delete anchor point tool, and you're on it because the opposite of the add anchor point tool, it's got a little minus symbol. And you're just going to go over the anchor that you want to delete and just click it, and the anchor point goes away, but it leaves your path closed rather than creating an open path. So if you wanted to, for whatever reason, let's say we wanted to make this sort of funky rectangle, you're just hitting your delete anchor point tool, and again it deletes the anchor points by creating and keeping the path closed instead of deleting an anchor point and then having to rejoin them. The delete anchor point tool comes in super handy. Again, a lot of times my work involves fixing other people's work. So a lot of times you'll see people will just have, I don't know, for no reason in particular, people will have like extra anchor points in an object. So like you can't see the extra anchor points here, right? If you're just looking at if you print this or if you're just looking at it on screen, right? You can't tell that there's 2 extra anchor points in here until you click on the direct selection tool. So a lot of times whenever I get artwork from people, I'll select all just to see what's going on with everything, just to see if there's extra anchor points, because a lot of times depending on your output, I know I mentioned it before, but like with sign shops and plotters and things like that, if there's extra points, that's going to be extra plot points where like a cutter is going to cut or something like that. Or sometimes in illustrations or breaking things down for screen printing, having just extra stuff can get in the way and cause problems. So a lot of times I'll check somebody's illustration and then I'll see, like, obviously there's no need for these 2 extra anchor points here on a straight line. So then I'll go to my delete anchor point tool and I'll delete those anchor points, and the object hasn't changed at all visually, but now physically obviously we don't have those 2 anchor points, so we don't have potentially extra things to get in the way and mess things up. So this brings us to joining paths. You can join open paths to create closed paths. We'll do it a little bit as we get more into the sort of meat of the assignment. But using these 2 objects as a guide here, I'm going to try to hover over my anchor point here. Hit escape so I can start my new shape. I'm just going to make, here we go, and hit escape. So let's say we want to join these 2 shapes, or these 2 paths rather, to make one sort of more complex shape, right? It's fairly easy. What you can do is, with your direct selection tool, if you select the anchor points that we want to join, and I'm holding shift and selecting these top 2 anchor points, and then I'm going to object, path, and join, or command J for join, and you'll see now it created a line or a path between those two anchor points. And then we're just going to do the same thing at the bottom here, holding shift, object, path, join, and now we sort of have this funkier shape that we've created by joining paths. Joining paths to create more complex shapes for illustrations. All right. Any questions about drawing straight lines, creating objects so far? Okay. So we'll talk about curved lines is where it can get a little bit trickier. If you guys have never worked with this before, it takes a little bit of time to get used to using the Bezier curve in the pen tool. And you'll see the book and the exercises have these handy little visual cues of where to drag your object. You'll see. So creating curved lines is a little bit different. We're still using the pen tool, but what you're doing is you're clicking and you're holding the mouse, and then we're just going to drag up to about the center of this whatever you would call the star visual cue here. And now you'll see this is the Bezier curve that I was referencing. The Bezier curve is this. I'm trying to like point to it without moving the mouse too much. So you see our line is curved now instead of being straight where it wants to make that anchor point. And then these funky visuals here is the actual curve tool, which you can adjust and manipulate after you drop down your anchor points. You'll see this adjusts the arc and the width of the curve. But you'll see here, as we go to this anchor, and we're clicking and holding, and pretty much drag down to here, that's almost on, and so on and so forth. I'll just do a couple of these because it's pretty much the same thing over and over. So I'm going to hit escape so I can show you adjusting these curves. So once you have these lines, let's say for argument's sake we have all this drawn out, you can use your direct selection tool, and let's zoom in a little bit here, and let's say we want to adjust this curve a little bit so that it matches the trace. This is where you have your Bezier curve, and you can adjust again the width and the arc of the curve. Oops. This is where I'm talking about, okay, so we have a white fill, so now it's covering up that blue. So I'm going to get rid of my fill so we can actually see it. So a lot of times when I'm readjusting a curve to fit, to trace something, I'll move it way out of the way just so it's a little bit messy. Oops, as I grabbed the wrong side. I'll move it way out of the way just so I can totally see what I'm snapping to. And then you can see, you can kind of try to get it. If you get right in the center of there, sometimes it's not exactly perfectly accurate, but you can get the general idea to get it just about dead on. And again, going to this point. So now if we adjust this handle, since it's in between two curves, it's going to adjust both sides of the curve. You see how it's doing that business. So what we want to do is we want to adjust the curve from this point to this point. So we want to go to this end curve here. Then this is where it gets kind of tricky. Again, it just takes playing with it, and honestly, sometimes a little trial and error. But the more you play with this, the sort of easier it becomes. So again, I'm going to move this way out of the way. And now you see here that curve is fairly dead on. Now if you want to continue, this works for curved lines or straight lines. If you want to continue working with your lines like this, what we can do is go back to your pen tool, and if you click at the end point, you see you get this, like, it's not quite a minus, but you get this like slash. So that's telling you that you are continuing a line. So again, clicking and holding and dragging. And I'm gonna sort of ignore the visual cue there. And then finishing it up. A little bit rough, but finishing up this sort of funky curve shape we have going on. So that's generally creating curved lines. Again, we're clicking and holding, and you can start that anywhere. So as you see, when you click and hold the first curve, or the first line, you're just indicating that this is going to be a curved anchor point. So now you can see you have that curved anchor. You don't always have to start with a curved anchor point either. Let me just delete that. You can start with a straight. A smooth anchor point, as they call it, versus a curved anchor point. But you can see your curves handle a little bit differently since you don't have two adjustment points. You can get sort of a more sweeping arch here than you do here with a little bit of a sort of stunted arch, as opposed to starting with your curved anchor point rather than the smooth anchor point. And again, it takes a little bit of trial and error. It takes a little bit of playing around with it. Then lastly, before we move on to getting into this, our assignment, I'll let you start playing with our assignment first before doing the sort of second part of this demo. The Convert Anchor Point tool here, when I talked about smooth anchor points versus or a corner point, when you convert, here, let's do this. Use a little bit of a different shape here. I'm going to add an anchor point at about the center of this curve here. And you can see adding that anchor point didn't really visually change the object at all. But now you see we have this extra curved anchor. Oops, helps if I actually, this extra curved anchor that we can adjust with its own handle. So this is what would be a curved anchor point. And let's say we wanted to convert that back to a smooth anchor point, or convert it to a smooth anchor point or a corner point. Now you can see we've converted it into a corner point, which is the same as these points that we created earlier. So all the points when you're just clicking to create these, when you're just clicking to create the shapes and not holding and dragging out your curve, are corner points. And all these points, when you're creating a curved, are smooth points, or sometimes people call them curved points. So if you wanted to, again, convert, and you'll see it converts from this point to this point. It's now converted that into two corner points, so now we have a straight path going from anchor to anchor or point to point. And we have a little bit of a curve on it still, because this point here is still a curved anchor. But again, obviously you see our adjustment is more limited to what it was before. And again, this can come in handy when it comes to creating a little bit more complex shapes. Like, let's grab an ellipse here. You know, if you wanted to sort of create a simplified teardrop kind of thing, you can convert that smooth point from an ellipse to a corner point, and then now you kind of have this corner point to adjust to create sort of like a quick water droplet, teardrop, whatever you want to call that kind of shape. So it allows you to manipulate objects to create different types of objects for your illustrations. We won't worry about that. Sorry, I was just looking at my notes again. Are there any questions? I know this is not terribly exciting to look at right now, but so for our assignment, we're going to be creating this little snowball guy. If you look in the chapter, you'll see him. And again, these are the parts. There are, like here, use the ellipse tool to make an oval. We've done this with our logo, right? So you're just going to use your ellipse tool and you're going to type. Oops, I opened up my other window. But here, instead of creating a circle, we're going to be doing one that's 0.75 wide and 1 inch tall. And then we're going to rotate it -30. And then it's got the instructions there to, so if you place it here and then make a scaled copy, when we do our scale at 25%, and we're going to hit copy instead of OK, so that we have two objects now. So here's our, we can like swap that. So there's our eyeball that we're going to have, right? So that's the only one that we're going to be creating using our shapes rather than our pen. And again, so it kind of walks you through. The tracing should be relatively easy. I'm going to turn off my fill, and I'll make this a funkier color. What you see as you go through, so for this one, you'll see it'll give you a cue, and you'll see when it wants you to create a smooth anchor point versus versus a corner point. So this will be a corner point. And then going to our, and it kind of gives you an idea of where to trace to. Now we don't want to make, well, yeah, we do. Going from here to here, we want to be that curved anchor. As you can see, it's still got that curve there, right? And then here, we're not going to click and hold because we want this one to be fairly straight. And then going to anchor point 5, we are going to click and hold to make that a curve. And give or take, hit the handles that they're showing. I should have picked a different color so it was a little bit more obvious. And then going back to going back to anchor 1 to complete the shape. I'll change that color so we can see it. And now we have roughly the shape of the hat. Matches pretty well. I did it pretty quick, but pretty close. So now we have our object to be able to create and apply a fill. Say we want to make his hat more navy, and we want to have the stroke of his hat be black, etc., etc. So now we have this object that we've created to add all of our attributes to. And what we'll be doing is once we finish making these shapes and assembling them, we'll get into next class. I'll talk a little bit about manipulating strokes and some advanced stroke options to give it a more illustrative look. We're going to be playing with this guy a little bit to give it sort of more kind of more of a hand-drawn or an illustrative look. The book talks about as well, we'll talk about image tracing a little bit later, but the book also talks about placing an illustration. There's this like sketchy snowball guy sort of in the middle of the exercises. They tell you to place them and use them as a guide to look at. You can, you don't have to, because you'll see as we go to place. So under File, Place is where, there we go, where you can place an image. I'm just going to go to my hard drive, to our book materials. We are in chapter 3, and we look for our snowball sketch. This is the file that they want you to go to, and then you're just going to hit place, and then you see you get this little preview, and you can either what I'm going to do, you can either just click, and if you click once, it just places it at whatever size the actual image is. Or if you wanted it to fill a specific size, you can click and hold and drag. So I'm just going to click once, and you'll see it just places it at whatever size the image actually was. 3 3/4, give or take. Or, just to show you, if we do our file place, go back to Snowball Kid guy here and there. You can also have it, if you click and drag, you can also place it at sort of a more specific size. Like if you had, I don't know, if you had a rectangle that you wanted it to fit, for example, you can click and hold and drag and have it be a different shape. For this illustration, it's not necessarily going to matter because it's just like sketchy illustration, and a lot of the images that the book uses are low res anyway. The potential issue that you can get into with placing objects like that by clicking and dragging them is you need to make sure that you have the resolution available. So like this, for example, at full size was like 3 3/4, give or take, and I made it 6, so I made it double almost the size that it was. So you can see, if we view, well, this is 200%, but you can see that the image is starting to break down a little bit. Obviously it's hard to tell because it's sort of like a sketchy, kind of goofy looking image, but as we zoom in a little bit, you can see that the image is starting to pixelate a little bit because we're going beyond the resolution of the image, right? We'll talk about more specifics later when we work with placing images, but the book starts to talk about placed images in this chapter, so I figured I would mention that. And it has you place this guy as a guide to our illustration. I'm honestly not necessarily sure why, because when we're finished it looks nothing like this. But I wanted to show you that just so there's no confusion. So again, what we're going to be doing is, for the first part of this assignment, we're going to be tracing these objects, and some of them you'll see here, most of them are closed paths, and some of them are open, like the nose is open, the eyebrow is open. Most of them are closed paths, and we're going to be creating these objects using our pen tool and giving them attributes, fills, strokes, stroke effects, etc., to sort of give them this more hand-drawn, illustrative look. Are there any questions? Yeah. Yeah.
So I did the first part of it. It's pretty self-explanatory.
Uh-huh.
It's like, oh, you're gonna like do something to look at this little mark, and then you're supposed to swoop over and just go ahead.
Okay, so let's go to the.
So between 3 and 4 is where I'm gonna.
Okay, so yeah, this is where. So we'll start, and I'll sort of do this roughly, but so this is where the pen tool can get a little bit tricky. Well, let me swap my So what's happening is this. When you're doing it, is that what's happening, or?
It's after the step where it's like hit the add tool or the command tool, and so that only the bottom entry is there, like it's shown.
Right. Yep. So there's a couple different ways. Oops, as I just hit the wrong thing. Come on. Why am I hitting the wrong thing here? Yeah, the nose can get a little bit tricky. And now I just screwed the whole thing up. Hold on a second. So specifically, let me actually get to it so we can creating that nose. There we go. Yeah, so we're going to be converting, oh, that's where, yeah, we're going to be converting the anchor point here. So we're going to be starting, we're going to click the pen tool on anchor 1 to start it with a corner point, and then we're going to create a smooth point here. And as you can see, it has our little guide. And then I'm just looking so I don't mess it up. So we're going to create smooth points at 2 and 3. Going to here, and then this is where so here's where we're going to be using our anchor point tool, and we're going to drag this handle down to here, right? So this way, what you're doing is, well, and I'll show you. So now what it's doing is it's kind of like flipping that curve, but you have to use that convert anchor point tool. Basically what you're doing is, well, and you'll see, and then as we go back to our pen tool, let me just make sure that I'm doing it the way the book says. So we're moving the top directional handle down to the red star as shown. Oh, I wasn't supposed to let go. Sorry. This is why I'm supposed to look at the book. I do it my way, and then so we're supposed to be holding down, oh, Alt, yeah, got it. So we're on your pen tool. You can hold Option or Alt, depending on if you're on a Mac or PC. And that brings you to, it's a shortcut to bring you to that convert anchor point tool. And so now if we let go of Alt, we can continue to draw. And then as we make that last, oops, why isn't it? This is a great demo. I'm talking and doing at the same time, that's the problem. There we go. So I need to be back on this tool here. Let me go back a couple steps here. All right, so going from our nose here, there we go. Now I'm going to hold Alt, drag that top handle here down to this red star, and there we go. It was because I let go. Now we still have our line here, and we can go from point 3 to 4, and now we can kind of drag this, and obviously you'll hit it a little better than I did, but now you can drag that shape there to get that curve going underneath. So the reason that we do that, let me go back a couple steps again. The reason that we do that, going back to my pen tool, and I want to start from here, going to anchor 3 again. Anyway, the reason that we do that is you'll see if we try to go from point 3 to 4 without dragging that handle down, the curve is going to be on top, right? Because this resize handle, or resize, this curve handle is at the top. So when we hold Option and drag that handle, I mean, to here, obviously for the nose, or wherever, as long as you're dragging it underneath this path, it's going to allow you to drop that curve below from path to path here instead of, and you can do that, again I'll do it here, and you can do that with just about any, basically what that does is it allows you to, I know the shapes looks a little funky, but it basically allows you to adjust your curve handles so that you can either have the curve, especially with, it's really, I shouldn't say only, but it's more relevant with open paths like this rather than closed paths. My nose looks a little funky here, but to keep creating that, you know, curve going from here to here, curve going from here to here, if you wanted to keep continuing it, you know, to have the curve keep going underneath, you would have to move that resize handle down. So that's why they tell you to do that, because if you don't bring that resize handle, or that, I keep saying resize, if you don't bring that curve handle down, it'll want to automatically have the curve go above it. Essentially, I think part of it, I'm probably going to be wrong, but I think part of it is it kind of picks the shortest point, but it kind of alternates. The curve sort of alternates horizontal and vertical. Anyway, you'll see as you start to draw, but that's sort of the trick to it. Is again going back. Hopefully that answered your question.
Is there another way to alternate the horizontal and vertical? Or is that just the best way?
I mean, for this, that's the best way to do it. I mean, it depends what you're drawing, really. That's why saying like alternating isn't exactly the best choice of words there. But for the purposes of this, because, and again, it's just because of how we're drawing this shape. You know, you need to again hit Alt, and while holding Alt, drag that resize handle down, and then going back to our curve here for our nose. If you wanted to, you know, again, it all depends on what you're drawing. If you're drawing sort of a, you know, a shape like this, where we're going to have, like if we wanted all these curves to be at the bottom, you would have to why is my Alt not working here? Oh, because I'm not hitting Alt. You know, you'd have to bring down that curve handle. You know, again, this is pretty ugly, but you get the idea. So you would have to continuously bring this down to about where you wanted it to create this sort of scallopy, this ugly scallop edge that I have going on here. So if you wanted all your curves to be at the bottom, it's just the way that the that the curve works when you have the handles on both sides of the anchor point. I don't know why I'm so blanking today. There is, and I was going to get into it next class, but when you're drawing a curve, sometimes you want to start, and the book will walk you through it, but sometimes you want to start with a corner point versus a smooth point. If you wanted to, let's say, give or take, I'm going to do about a 1/4 inch. And let's say we wanted, you know, that curve to be about, give or take there. If you click back on that anchor point, as we hover over the anchor point, you see you get that curved anchor point, or the convert anchor point, rather. And let's go another, give or take, 1/4 inch. And now, depending on which way you drag, now if you drag down just about every time, going back, so basically what you're doing is you're converting one end, you're converting this to a corner point rather than having it be a smooth point on both sides. So it only gives you the one resize handle, so you can get this sort of scalloped looking. So this way your curves are all on the same side, right? So it doesn't kind of like alternate. It's not necessarily, and this is where I said alternate is probably not the best way to the best word to use, but it basically gives you adjustments, adjustment arms on both sides of the curve of the point. So it's giving you, it's basically the difference between the corner point versus a smooth point. But if you already draw, like here, how we already drew the curve, and then we're converting that point back to a smooth point. So technically, it's a smooth point with one curve. So this is technically a corner point, but the path from corner point to corner point is a curved path. Does that make sense? So if it's a corner point, if it's a smooth point, it's going to have adjustment handles on both sides. So the other trick, I guess, theoretically that you could do, going back to our nose, and then I'll leave it alone, is again, I'll do this like super fast. If we wanted to, this is where I was rushing and going too fast, but if we wanted to go to here, what you can do, and it's not going to be exactly the same because it's going to depend on the type of illustration that you want, because you want this sort of deep-ish curve. But if you go back and you create, so now this is a corner point, right? So it's not allowing us to have that adjustment arm. But if you were to click and hold and drag, obviously it's going to be a little bit different. You're not going to be able to get it exact because you're going to have less adjustment points here. You still want to have that. Go back to here. The reason that they have you bring that handle down instead of doing what I just did, converting that to a corner point and then having this be a curved point, is it gives you, obviously you can see it gives you a little bit more adjustability. Is that a word? I don't think so. But you get the idea. You can have here, like we can try to hit this curve sort of all we want, but it's not going to match. It's not going to match that curve perfectly because we don't have the two sides of the handle to adjust. I mean, it's going to be close, but that's why they have you bring that handle down to here so that we still have technically the two sides of that curve point to adjust from, so you get like a nice smooth curve instead of this sort of more stunted curve, I guess. And again, that's just going to depend on the illustration. I mean, obviously, for a cartoon snowball kid, like, that's not terrible.
What would happen if you got the 3, adjusted it to a corner point,
Uh-huh.
and then pulled the handle straight down to the dot, and then did the last one?
Well,
So you start at 1, go to 2, pull the handle.
yep,
Go to 3, pull the handle.
yep.
Convert 3 to a corner, pull the handle down again from 3. Then go to 4.
Right, which is, I think, what I did. So go to 1 to 2, 2 to 3, right?
And then convert 3 on hand, to a corner.
Right, and that's what I did before.
But then pull from 3 down like a handle.
What do you mean?
When you click it and pull down.
But I need to click to create another anchor point somewhere.
Oh. Okay.
You know what I mean? So like right now, this is the last anchor point that we're on, right?
Yeah.
So you would need to create another anchor point
Gotcha.
somewhere else
I'm just wondering if
to have that. Yeah.
before you click it, if you could like when you click it, you could pull it, drag it down. And
Nope, because there's nothing to drag. There's nothing to drag down. There's this resize hand. I keep saying resize. There's this adjustment handle, and that's it.
Is it like a broken line but not
Mm,
like the start one or a start one?
no, not really, because I mean this is your start point, but it's just that this is a corner point rather than a curve point now. So again, the difference between doing that. So if we go to 3, from 3 to 4, and click and
Yeah. Then
you know,
go sharp one.
yeah, exactly. It's a little bit sharper rather than. Did I miss it?
Okay, I see what you're doing.
Rather than going.
That's what I was wondering. if
Yep.
it's on that.
Yeah, so basically you're going to get, again, to go back to here, you're basically going to get, and then holding Option, it basically just allows you to get a nice smooth curve rather than, and it's still, I mean, it's a pretty sharp, visually, it's a pretty sharp corner, obviously, but it's not a corner point. And again, it's just going to depend on the illustration. I mean, having that, the way I tried to do it, where you convert it first and then go to 4, like having it be a little bit of a sharper curve. I mean, for the purposes of this assignment, obviously it's not the way to do it. But if you were to have an illustration that did look like that, like his nostrils a little bit sharper, like it's a drawing, it's really not that. It's not the end of the world, right? So it really just is going to depend on what your application is.